it's indeed my privilege that I'm given the opportunity to give the memorial address for Dr. P.C. Jain. And I am indebted to Suresh, for instance, for the same. He's the one who actually always put me forward in every forum. And thank you, Suresh, for that. And with Suresh himself, my association goes back to more than 30 years. So I'll just begin my address. First of all, I'll talk about my encounters with Dr. Prem Jain, and then subsequently I'll come to the IGBC and its role. Then I'll touch upon the future of green building and sustainable traditions in India, and how P.C. Jain actually touched a kind of primordial chord in the psyche of India when the way he articulated the formation of the IGBC. So it's almost half a century since I met Dr. Prem Jain for the first time in the corridors of SPA Delhi, as then I was a student of Masters of Urban Design. Back in 1973, that was. And I think Dr. Jain had just joined as a teacher. And one remembers him because if you see his face once, you cannot forget it, because he has the most radiant smile that you can see in anyone's face. After that, back in 1981, as an architect practicing in Hyderabad, I had visited ICRISAT, that is the center that was sponsored by UNESCO and then designed by Stein and Doshi. It's outside Hyderabad, and a sustainable campus development project. Dr. Jain, I later learned, was the consultant to Joseph Wallenstein and B.V. Doshi for that project. And therein he began a long association with Hyderabad. That was the first encounter with a large solar farm, along with the application of other sustainable campus development features. For me, I was seeing it for the first time. And as fate would have it, one of the first projects I got built in the early 80s in Delhi was the Chinmaya Mission in Lodi Estate, where Dr. Prem Jain's newly formed consultancy called Spectral provided the services design. I cannot forget those extremely educative interactions that I've had with Prem Jain at that time. And he had a way of putting you at ease. And that sense of being a good human being was not a quality in him by itself. It was accompanied by a very competent professional approach to work. So there were lessons to learn from in many ways from Prem Jain there. And as a founding member of the IGBC and their later attempts towards a green building, the CII Shorabji Godrej Green Building Center in Hyderabad had already become very famous among the professionals. I was lucky to have been invited as part of a group of architects to visit the building where Dr. Prem Jain and Karan Grover, who was the architect of the building, explained the salient features of the buildings to our visiting delegation. I ran into Dr. Prem Jain in a number of seminars and other fora in Delhi, including in the Delhi Urban Art Commission. As the then chairman of DUAC, I had rejected the Ministry of Environment's proposal designed and presented by the CPW. It was unfortunate that the building was not really befitting, in my view at that time, or in the Commission's view at that time. It was not befitting the Ministry of Environment to say they had, for instance, a big fiberglass dome copying the Rashtrapati Bhavan. Okay? So that was rather comical to see that such a thing could be done. And we rejected the scheme, even though Jairam Ramesh himself was personally involved in promoting that scheme. Then, after it was rejected, the Minister of MOEF, Jairam Ramesh, was quick to convene an expert group led by Dr. Prem Jain to redesign the scheme as an example befitting the headquarters of the Ministry of Environment and Forests. The project was later cleared and built with Dr. Prem Jain at its help of advisory committee. It was again built by the CPWD, but Dr. Prem Jain had introduced so many green features into the building that the commission was very happy to clear the project afterwards. Jairam Ramesh even arranged a separate visit for me into the ministry, where Dr. Prem Jain and his other colleagues made a separate presentation to figure out whether everything is okay or not. And of course, it was a cakewalk for them when they came into the commission, and it was cleared immediately and it's built. It continues to be one of the better green buildings in Delhi. Years later, when I was the dean of the RIC School of Built Environment, it was our intent to structurally embed the discipline of sustainable design in the curriculum for construction project management and real estate finance. The RIC School of Built Environment was giving an MBA to students with architecture and engineering background, specialized MBA in construction project management and real estate finance. And as you all know, that's an area where you need to doubly emphasize the requirement and need for green buildings. And many of them are only see it as a nuisance, used to see them as a nuisance. And it was very important for us to reinforce the subject of sustainability. And needless to say, I approached Dr. Jain to help set up a student chapter of IGBC in the school. Dr. Ashish Rakheja, who was been a partner of Dr. Prem Jain, was kind enough to come to the RIC school as well. And we had innumerable events year after year for the IGBC student chapter. And Dr. Prem Jain had very often gracefully accepted our invitation to meet the students and inspire them. The contribution, this is a contribution which I can never forget, because it was so important for us to ensure that students who are really going into the so-called business world of construction are aware and are all convinced of the need for a sustainable built environment. The formation of IGBC at Hyderabad was the next, I think, important milestone. The USA and CII came together for the first time to open its portal to India. This led to the convergence of CII, USAID, USGBC, and Jamshedji Godrej, bringing together a brilliant professional group of building industry to build India's first LEED Platinum rated CII Sorabji Godrej Green Building Center. It received the LEED rating in October 2003 first, and then subsequently was reinforced by another one as zero emission building later in, I think, in 2017 or so. The CII launched the Indian Green Building Council in 2001 in Hyderabad with the blessings of the then CM Chandrababu Naidu, who was a very forward-looking chief minister, committed to technology and looking at future of Hyderabad through technological growth. Albeit in a modified form to deal with the Indian conditions, the IGBC was subsequently approved to use LEED program so that it can be applied to buildings across India. For building labor, improving the conditions of materials, using indigenous materials, and improving the conditions of building labor were part of the Indian reality that were factored into the new LEED rating. This is an important step as far as India is concerned. The CII Sorabji Godrej Green Buildings and Business Center was revalidated at net zero energy platinum rated building in 2019. Dr. Prem Jain's open-mindedness and belief in the fact that any movement that sustains in India also needs to sustain itself spiritually led to an embedded foundation of competence, ethics, and professionalism in the IGBC's future endeavors. He identified the Panchabhutas, the 5 elements of nature, to become the framework for the green building movement in India. This included green materials, clean air, reduced energy consumption, a balanced approach to water, and the general well-being embodied in the building as a healing environment. And this is a very important factor because it's for the first time that the building is looked at as an environment which can heal the human psyche. Now, apart from looking at all these nuts and bolts issues of engineering, he also championed the cause of recycling of materials, recycle of construction debris, for instance, and many areas which are unthought of in the earlier attempts to attain sustainability. With such unshakable foundation, it is no wonder that the green building movement in India has since grown into a continuing success story. Dr. Prem Jain was himself surprised at this phenomenal growth. As a logical corollary, it now spans across multiple growth areas, from green city movement, from the building to the city, green neighborhoods, green construction industry, and even green interior design. India now has more than 5.7 billion square foot of green footprint. Dr. Prem Jain, wherever he is now, must be still radiating his inimitable smile because of this tremendous achievement. His organizational ability and firm leadership has seen the spread of green building movement amongst thousands of professionals, students, and builders across India. Exploring the subject in a far more nuanced way from its beginnings, that is, for the first time, he ensured that the industry is in it with him. That is, the industry was also tuned in to champion the cause of green building. And in his inimitable way, he brought out the value of green building as a force in the marketing process of buildings. And today you can see so many hoardings across the country where the building is proudly proclaiming that they are a green building as a method of marketing the building. Now, this is a great achievement to connect a completely idealistic framework of green building to that of the marketing and profiteering domain in the real estate sector. This was a very singular achievement of Dr. Jain that he was able to move it into that domain. Now let's look at the green future of India. However, the here and now of climate crisis is now a living reality for all professionals in the building industry. Efforts are on from United Nations to local self-governments to combat the ill effects of climate change, and India, as a signatory to all the international moves, have formulated comprehensive climate action policy. And Dr. Jain had a stellar role to play in the formulation of many of these policies. How much of this is an action in real terms from the declared policy still has many question marks. Yet, India's green building movement has gained massive professional following through private enterprise, while regulative efforts remain extremely unsatisfactory. As a nation, we are not left wanting in intellectual prowess, while implementation remains always at an abysmal level and a challenge for India. The United Nations shifted gear in the new SDGs outline for sustainability in 2015 with a major departure, refocusing on the human being from material sustainability. In other words, in the earlier avatars, the idea of sustainability in the UN meant ensuring that we hand over the resources that we receive to the next generation. And it was always, the emphasis was on resources and judicious spending of resources and ensuring that the self-sustaining systems in nature is not hampered so that the future generations can benefit from what we leave behind. India was a signatory to all these, and in 5 years review of its performance by the year 2022, we'll have to demonstrate what we have done. Of the 17 SDGs, which were extremely comprehensive, only one goal, that is goal number 11, among the 17 goals outlined by the UN, only goal number 11 directly addresses the issue of city and the built environment. Directly. All other issues also add up, like sustainability and issues like water, energy, labor. All these are addressed. Health. All these are addressed in the 17 goals. But most directly mentioned is goal number 11, where they discuss buildings. And it's interesting to note that IGBC's first prescriptions of labor welfare and provision of amenities for labor already echoes the SDGs' improved focus on the human component of construction industry. In other words, IGBC had the foresight to see that it is the human component which is going to be as critical as that of the material and economic components. To that extent, the success of green building movement in India would offset the nation's implementation or lack of implementation of the SDG goals. In order to subvert the inertia of bureaucratic action process, across the world, the UN had already brought out in the year 2000 the UN Global Compact. It's also an offset of UN, originally proposed by Kofi Annan and subsequently implemented. It continues to be implemented, which the UK-based Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors, that's the RICS, was a partner and a signatory. And they were collaborators in the whole process. And I was also a member of the 15th anniversary meeting of the UNGC in the UN headquarters in New York, representing the construction industry as a member of the RICS delegation. RICS has a delegation of 5 people drawn from around the world, and I was fortunate enough to be one of the members of the RICS delegation. The objective of the UNGC has embedded them, most of the 17 goals. It has embedded in them, the UNGC has embedded in them. It's the UNGC's UN Global Compact. And Kofi Annan and his idea of direct cooperation, cooperative action with the industries rose from the fact that UN's effort at creating sustainable future lost much of its momentum while trickling down to the sustainable action by the industry. The meeting of UNGC had no governmental representation, but only the institutions of different industries and the UN itself. Considering IGBC's tremendous success outside the domain of governments, it will not be off the mark to say that IGBC could directly become a part of the UNGC alliance in the UN, as its spread and depth, as envisaged by Dr. Prem Jain and his team. The green building goals of IGBC already address many of the UNGC codes. UNGC has also outlined a separate set of goals to be achieved, and they have also co-opted many educational institutions. And I represented the RICS School of Built Environment as part of the RICS delegation, was lucky to attend the forum in the UN, the 15th year forum. That was a milestone forum for the UNGC. The universal acceptance of green building principles by the industry, academia, and the stakeholders in India, even in the absence of stringent regulatory measures, is a pointer to the deeper values and ethics promoted by Dr. Jain within the movement. From a mere technical and transactional view of the IGBC moved and has embraced the humane attitudes and embodied spirituality that's embedded in the Indian psyche to touch the ethical. A reverential relationship with nature that has been part of India's highly plural ethos already provided a fertile ground for the green building movement to take root. This is behind the phenomenal success of the green building movement, not only because of the clever organizational strategies and consistent effort to spread the ideology across the professions, but also because we have a population in India which is already here we can remember that Mahavira, over 2,600 years ago, had already championed the cause of forest protection, women's rights, and universal compassion for all sentient beings, including trees, animals. Buddhism, which grew in parallel with Jainism at that time, also embodied tree worship and compassion as the fundamental tenets of holistic life. We must remember that Buddha, in fact, began as a Jain monk. In the first few years, he had joined the Jain sect with Mahavira, who was then the 24th Tirthankara in 6th century BC. You can imagine when the first Tirthankara or Adinath was, because the one before Mahavira was 300 years before. That's the 23rd Tirthankara was 300 years before. So you can imagine where into the depths of history, in the depths of time, that Adinath would go. And considering that Buddha began as a monk, in Jain monk, then he went into Maunavrata and was not seen for about 8 years. Then he reappears in Sarnath and gives his first public lecture. In other words, he took the ideals of Buddhism to a new height in communication. Buddhism, which grew in parallel with Jainism, I told you Mahavira was already the 24th Tirthankara and Buddha was just emerging. He was 40 years younger to Mahavira in age. And they had embodied tree worship and compassion as the fundamental tenets of holistic life. Mahavira's 5 critical principles of right living were subsequently echoed interestingly by Mahatma Gandhi through his spiritual mentor Srimad Rajchandra of Dharampur in Gujarat. Mahatma Gandhi was in constant conversation with Srimad Rajchandra. They were both contemporaries in age, but Gandhi wrote a series of letters from South Africa and England to Rajchandra, and those letters are now published. And then Srimad Rajchandra, who was a follower of Mahavira, would then reply those questions. They were all philosophical inquiries. And the interesting part is Mahatma Gandhi, through his spiritual mentor Srimad Rajchandra in the late 1920s, I think it was around 1928 or so, that they were in conversation. The 5 principles of Mahavira are non-violence, that is ahimsa, truthfulness, which is satya. Actually, truthfulness or satya has a totally different interpretation in Jainism, because you have a concept called anekantavada. That means whichever trajectory you move through, you will find your own truth of that trajectory. And the interesting thing is that that means there is no absolute truth. That truth is relative, and it's pursuit of that relative truth which makes the human being a finer human being. And then more importantly, we had non-possession, or what is called aparigraha, which seems to have influenced Dr. Prem Jain extensively, because when Payal was kind enough to send me his new book, I found that aparigraha is mentioned in a number of places. And it was one of the important principles that he followed. Then we have non-stealing, that is asteya. Asteya does not mean that you go and steal someone's things personally or materially, but it also means depriving someone else in thought. It's a very subtle explanation. And the last of it was brahmacharya, or chastity. Of all these 5 principles of aparigraha is particularly pertinent to the green building movement. It means consuming only what one needs for the self-sustenance of the body and soul, and not in unbridled exploitation of nature. For everyone's need, but not for everyone's greed. It's a famous quote that we find from Gandhi. He is, in fact, echoing aparigraha. As much as the Greenpeace, who are now contemporary champions of environment protection, goes by the dictum reduce, reuse, recycle, they are also not saying anything different from aparigraha. And the word aparigraha recurs in Dr. Prem Jain's writing as a basic tenet of sustainable building practice. The frugality of Mahatma Gandhi, the way he clothed himself, his frugal possessions, the frugality that he practiced in his daily life and in his relationships, even his utopian concept of Gram Swaraj have aparigraha as its underpinning. It was Gandhi's genius to convert each one of these Mahavira's principles towards an ethically driven politics, which he effectively turned into a political weapon against colonization. His ability to penetrate even the most remote villages of India had their root in the same fertile psyche of Indian people. The IGBC's mediations of the goals of USGBC, in fact, effectively achieved what the freedom movement could have achieved through the Gandhian mission inherited from Mahavira and Rajchandra. The current chairman of IGBC, Mr. V. Suresh, my old friend of 30 years standing, also has a history of championing sustainable construction through the Nirmiti Kendras when he was with the HUDCO. Laurie Baker, the pioneering Gandhian architect, became the symbol of sustainability through the Gandhian principles of frugality in construction, was turned into a buzzword in sustainability by Mr. V. Suresh when he was at the helm of affairs in HUDCO. I am sure, armed with this history of sustainable buildings and firm faith in the Indian values, Mr. Suresh would also step lightly into the sensitive soul of India's embodied values. Let's hope that as much as technology application would guide the future course of green building movement in India, Dr. Prem Jain's visionary recognition of India to hold hand with the SDGs and climate mitigation measures to ethically drive the green building movement for the well-being of all. Could we bring Dr. Prem Jain's contagious smile to every stakeholder involved in the efforts to build a better world? That's the question I end with. Thank you very much. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak in this forum. Thank you.